All right, so get ready because today we're going to be exploring Cantonese, like really diving in. We're going to go way beyond those oversimplified dialect labels that get thrown around. We're going to uncover what makes this language so captivating and unique, from its deep cultural roots to like its complex relationship with Mandarin and even the intricacies of how it's written.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case study when you think about it, especially when you consider like how many people speak Cantonese. It's a massive amount, over 82.4 million people worldwide.
Wow.
I know, right? That's more than some European countries.
That's wild. Okay, so that really shows just how important Cantonese is on a global scale.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's more than just numbers, right? Like, this language is seriously intertwined with cultural identity.
Oh, for sure. And thinking about Cantonese only within like Southeast China, Hong Kong, and Macau, that just doesn't even begin to tell the whole story. The Cantonese diaspora is everywhere, all over the globe. Their language is key to those cultural connections.
Right? It's almost like a thread that connects people, right?
Yeah.
Through generations and across continents. And speaking of culture, the unique art forms that have come out of Cantonese culture are so cool. We always hear about Chinese opera, but what makes Cantonese opera different?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, it's not just about the language, although that's a huge part of it.
Right.
Cantonese opera, or Yuju as it's known, developed its own distinct singing styles and costumes, makeup traditions, everything. It's actually way more flamboyant than other types of Chinese opera, like Beijing opera, which is often seen as more stripped down. Cantonese opera also uses a wider range of musical instruments.
Wow. So it's like a totally different artistic experience. Even though at the end of the day, they both fall under the category of Chinese opera, it just goes to show how vital the cultural context is. It shapes these art forms.
Exactly, exactly. And, that kind of leads into why the whole Cantonese versus Mandarin thing can be such a sensitive topic for people. Because it's not just about two different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah. So it'd be easy to assume that Cantonese and Mandarin are mutually intelligible, that speakers can understand each other.
Yeah.
But it's actually way more complicated than that.
You got it. Think of it like Spanish and Italian. They both have shared roots, right? But there's no way you can totally understand a conversation in Italian if you only speak Spanish. Cantonese and Mandarin are kind of similar. Yeah, you might catch a few words here and there if you only speak one. But the pronunciation, grammar, sentence structure, it's all totally different.
It's like there's siblings who might share a family resemblance, but they've each got their own like totally unique personality. And then on top of that, the way Cantonese is written down adds another layer of complexity.
Right. It's super interesting. Both Cantonese and Mandarin can be written down in a way that perfectly matches the spoken language. Like, you can capture every single sound, every little nuance in the written form. But here's the thing. A lot of Cantonese speakers don't actually know the full written vocabulary for their own spoken language, if that makes sense.
Wait, hold on. How is that even possible?
So basically, it's because of the long history of Mandarin being dominant in formal settings, in government, education, all that. So over time, a kind of formal written Cantonese developed, and on paper, it looks a lot like Mandarin. You could see something that looks like standard written Chinese, but when it's read aloud in Cantonese, it sounds totally different.
That's so wild. It really shows how adaptable Cantonese is. It's found a way to express itself even within a system that often prioritizes a different language.
Yeah, exactly. And it shows how resilient Cantonese is. This is super clear when you look at how informal written Cantonese is everywhere, online and in comics.
Right. It makes you think about how language changes to fit the needs of the people who speak it. But, even just the word Cantonese could be kind of confusing, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of history behind all the terms we use. Like, Canton speech sounds very specific, very tied to the city and its history as a trading hub. And even just Cantonese can mean different things. It's sometimes used to refer to the whole Yu branch of Chinese languages, not just the specific variety spoken in Guangzhou.
It really goes to show that we should pay close attention to the labels we use, what they might actually mean or who they might exclude. It sounds like Cantonese has been on a real journey over the years.
Oh yeah, big time. You can actually trace its rise to prominence back to the Southern Song dynasty. Guangzhou, which was called Canton back then, was this crazy busy center of trade, and that's really when Cantonese became like the language to know.
Mhm.
It gained prestige, a reputation as the language of business and culture.
So it kind of rode those trade routes, right?
Yeah.
Like hitching a ride on the ships and spreading to new places.
Basically, and then those big migrations in the 19th and 20th centuries, those were really important for Cantonese becoming the dominant language in Hong Kong and Macau. They shaped the linguistic landscape that we see today.
Right. It's a perfect example of how migration changes language, changes culture. But it hasn't always been easy for Cantonese, right? Especially if you think about the role of Mandarin in mainland China.
That's true. It's been a source of tension for sure, the push for Mandarin to be the official language everywhere.
And this is where things get interesting, because understanding Cantonese is about way more than just like linguistics. It's about identity, politics, and even resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. The language you speak is intensely personal. It's tied up with your heritage, your sense of self. So when people feel like their language is being ignored or pushed aside, it's only natural that they push back.
Right. It's an act of preserving who you are. So how does that play out in a place like Hong Kong, where Cantonese is an official language?
Great question. That takes us right to the heart of the struggles and the successes that Cantonese embodies today.
So we've got Cantonese, this language that's officially recognized in Hong Kong and Macau, used in the government, in courts, even in schools. You'd think that would mean things are like set for Cantonese. But it's not really that simple, is it?
No, not really. It's actually a great example of how a language becomes like a symbol for something bigger. In Hong Kong, especially since the handover, Cantonese represents a distinct cultural identity, something separate from mainland China, you know?
Yeah, I get that. It's like holding on to something unique
Yeah.
when you're surrounded by this huge cultural influence.
Right, exactly. And that feeling, that need to protect your language, to keep it alive, it resonates with communities all over the world, not just in Hong Kong. Like, think about Chinese diasporas. When your language is often misunderstood, called a dialect, or even just like dismissed, it becomes even more important to hold on to it.
Yeah, it's almost like an act of defiance, right? Like saying, this is a part of who I am, and I'm not going to let it disappear.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the words themselves. It's about everything those words represent.
Yeah.
The stories, the jokes, the songs. It's about entire cultural traditions being passed down.
Oh, and speaking of songs, we can't forget Cantopop. The article mentions it, but I'm kind of curious to hear more about it. What is it about Cantonese that makes it work so well for pop music?
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, right? I mean, Cantopop has fans all over the world. And you're right, the language itself has a lot to do with it. Cantonese is just very musical.
Is it because of the tones?
Yeah, partly. The tones in Cantonese make it really easy to create catchy melodies and play around with words in fun ways. But it's more than that, too. Cantonese just has this lyrical quality, you know? It seems to really connect with the emotions that pop music often explores.
I totally see that. Even when I don't understand all the lyrics, I can still feel the emotion in Cantopop. It's like
Yeah.
the sound of the language itself is expressive.
It totally is. And it's interesting to think about how Cantopop has actually shaped how people around the world see Cantonese. Even people who don't speak a word of it, they still know Cantopop songs, you know?
It's like Cantopop is this ambassador for the language, sharing it with the world through catchy tunes.
Exactly. And it kind of creates this feedback loop. Did you know that some of the biggest Cantopop stars are actually native Mandarin speakers?
No way, really? I had no idea.
Yeah. They learned Cantonese specifically to sing Cantopop. It shows you the power and influence of the genre.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about how Cantonese is spoken, how it's sung, even how it shows up in informal writing. But what about like the nuts and bolts of how it's spoken? The article talks about Cantonese phonology, which is basically the system of sounds, and it sounds surprisingly complex.
Oh, it definitely is. And that's where all the regional differences within Cantonese come in. The article mentions that the standard way of pronouncing Cantonese is based on how it's spoken in Guangzhou.
Which makes sense, considering its history.
Right. But here's the thing. Hong Kong Cantonese, while super similar to Guangzhou Cantonese, has developed its own little quirks over time. The article even calls some of them lazy pronunciations. Although that term causes a lot of debate among linguists, of course.
Lazy pronunciation. I'm picturing like someone really drawing out their vowels or something. What does that even mean?
Basically, it's about how certain vowel and consonant sounds that are distinct in Guangzhou Cantonese have kind of merged together in Hong Kong Cantonese. Like, over time, they've become the same sound. Think of it as language evolution happening in real time, shaped by the unique social and cultural context of Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It reminds you that language is always changing, always adapting.
Yeah.
Okay, but speaking of distinct sounds, we Gotta talk about tones in Cantonese.
Right.
I've heard they can be really tricky for people trying to learn the language.
Oh, they can be tough, but they're also what gives Cantonese that musical quality we were talking about. You see, in English, your tone of voice might change how you say something, but it doesn't change the meaning of the word itself. But in Cantonese, tones are everything.
Wait, so you mean a single word can have a totally different meaning depending on the tone you use?
You got it. Like, take the syllable si, for example. Depending on the tone, whether it's high falling, medium rising, low falling, low rising, or low level pass, it can mean poetry, history, to try, time, city, or to be. Crazy, right?
That is wild. It's amazing how much information our voices can convey just by changing our pitch.
It's incredible, the complexity of language, and it makes you realize how much work goes into mastering a language like Cantonese.
For sure. Okay, so we've got these tones, these subtle shifts in pitch that can completely change the meaning of a word. How is that even represented in written Cantonese?
That's where things get really interesting, especially with Mandarin being the dominant written form for Chinese.
Because they use the same characters, right?
Yeah, exactly. Cantonese and Mandarin both use traditional Chinese characters, but written Cantonese often uses characters or combinations of characters that you wouldn't normally see in standard written Chinese, which is very influenced by Mandarin.
So it's like written Cantonese has its own set of tools to capture all those nuances in the spoken language.
Exactly. And you see this a lot in casual writing, like in magazines, advertisements, social media, places where everyday Cantonese is the norm. It's about reflecting how people actually speak and write, even if it's a little different from the formal, standardized way.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about when you need a more formal tone? Like in official documents, newspapers, academic stuff.
Well, that's where standard written Chinese, which is heavily influenced by Mandarin, still holds sway. It helps to make sure everything is clear and consistent, especially across different regions.
So it's like these two systems are existing side by side, almost like parallel universes of written Cantonese.
It's really interesting, and it highlights the tension between wanting to preserve the unique aspects of Cantonese and needing a standardized written form that everyone can understand.
So how do people even learn to navigate these different systems?
Well, that's where things like romanization come in.
Romanization, right. So that's where you're trying to write down the sounds of Cantonese using, like, the English alphabet.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying to catch Cantonese in a Roman net.
It's really helpful for language learners, even if it's just to get the pronunciation kind of close.
For sure, it's a good tool. And, it kind of reminds me of something we've been talking about this whole time. All the different ways Cantonese has been, analyzed and studied, and maybe even like forced to fit into systems that were made for other languages.
Right, like trying to squeeze it into a box that doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it.
There's this whole theme of adaptation that runs through the history of Cantonese.
Totally. And romanization is a perfect example. The article talks about a bunch of different systems, like there's Yale, Yutping, and then the one the Chinese government came up with, Guangdong romanization. They all have their own logic, their own way of doing things, but none of them have really become the way to write Cantonese in Roman letters.
So it's like a romanization showdown.
Kind of, yeah. And the funny thing is, most Cantonese speakers, especially in Hong Kong, don't really know any of these systems that well. They might recognize a couple common spellings, but romanization isn't really part of their everyday lives.
Why do you think that is? It seems like with so much global communication happening, a standard romanization would be super useful.
I think it comes down to how Cantonese is taught and used. It's primarily an oral language, so those romanization systems haven't really been integrated into education or daily life.
Right. It's a good reminder that language is about way more than just rules in a textbook. It's about people, about how they actually communicate.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the big question. What's the future of Cantonese? Where does it fit in with everything else?
Especially in a world where Mandarin is everywhere.
It's a tough balance. Like a lot of less dominant languages, Cantonese has to find a way to preserve its heritage while also adapting to a constantly changing linguistic landscape.
Like walking a tightrope.
That's a great way to put it. On one side, you've got this deep desire to celebrate Cantonese, to make sure people recognize how unique and special it is, especially when it's being called just a dialect.
But on the other side, there's this pressure to just switch to Mandarin for practical reasons.
Exactly. I mean, think about education, jobs, even just being able to navigate a world where Mandarin is seen as the language of success, both in China and internationally.
It shows you how language, identity, and power are all connected.
Totally. And those power dynamics are super important if you really want to understand the challenges and possibilities for Cantonese in the future.
So, like things like younger generations losing their Cantonese fluency. That seems to be a big worry for a lot of people.
It's definitely a valid concern. As the world gets more connected and as Mandarin's influence grows, there's a chance that Cantonese, especially all its unique features, could get lost.
And it wouldn't just be words that are lost,
Right.
right? It would be an entire cultural heritage, a unique way of seeing the world.
You got it. All those stories, the songs, even the jokes, everything that makes Cantonese special would be affected. That's why all those efforts to keep Cantonese alive and thriving are so important.
What are some of the ways people are doing that?
Well, continued official support is huge. Places like Hong Kong and Macau, where it's still an official language, they need to keep teaching it in schools, using it in government, promoting it in the media.
So it's about visibility, making sure people see and hear Cantonese.
Exactly. But it's more than just like official stuff. Grassroots movements, people just coming together because they love the language, that's vital too. We see it online, like we've talked about. Informal written Cantonese is everywhere. Cantopop is finding new fans all over the world. It all makes a difference.
It's like taking ownership of the language, making it relevant to new generations in a way that feels authentic.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. And it speaks to something crucial about language revitalization. It can't just be about old textbooks and formal pronouncements. It has to be about bringing the language to life in everyday situations.
Totally. It's got to be about those silly Cantonese rhymes your grandma used to sing, the jokes you share with your friends, even those heated online debates about grammar rules.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's those small, everyday moments that keep a language alive.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, from just a few basic facts about Cantonese to a much deeper understanding of how complex it is, how culturally significant it is. It's been amazing.
I'm so glad you think so. I've really enjoyed talking about all this with you.
And to all our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about Cantonese. So if you're feeling inspired, why not check it out a little more? Listen to some Cantopop, watch a Cantonese film, maybe even learn a few phrases. You might be surprised by what you discover.
I love that. In the end, languages are all about connecting with people, seeing the world from new perspectives. It's about celebrating the incredible diversity of human expression.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this incredible exploration of Cantonese. Until next time, everybody, stay curious.